Okay, thanks everyone for coming. A couple of weeks ago, I was at Southwark Coroner's Court at the opening of the inquest into the death of Sean Rigg, a young black man who was picked up by the police in 2008 and ended up dead hours later in a police station. And his brother, Marcy Rigg, opened up with her testimony and talked about really, who Sean was, that he was a musician, an artist, he was a son, a brother, a father who ended up dying alone, surrounded by police officers in a cage in the back of Brixton police station. And what the family are hoping is that at the end of the 7-week inquest that they will get a verdict of unlawful killing, because that will enable them to pursue a prosecution against the police to try and get some kind of justice for their brother. And I think that's one of many campaigns that it's very important that we support, because you only have to look at the figures to know that the Rigg family have got a very hard fight on their hands. Inquest, the charity which monitors these cases, say that there has been the equivalent of 1 death a week in police custody since 1990. And despite a number of unlawful verdicts being returned, not a single police officer has been prosecuted. In fact, the last time that a copper was prosecuted for manslaughter or murder was for the racist murder of David Allowale in 1969, when 2 officers were sent down basically for a few months each. And all too often we know in these cases that the victims are black men. I'm sure that many of us can think of the names of some. Christopher Alder, who died on the floor of a police cell while officers made monkey noises. Smiley Culture, who we are supposed to believe stabbed himself in the heart during a police raid. Mark Duggan, who was shot in cold blood in Tottenham High Street. But there's also many that we don't get to hear about as well. I was sitting next to a guy in the court and asked him why he was here. And he said that he was there really because this had happened to his own son, a 23-year-old who just finished his MA, who died whilst being restrained by the police. And his name was Sean Lewis. And really, when you sat in the coroner's court, it was packed with all kinds of people who'd been affected in one way or another by police violence. There was Alfie Meadows. He was a student who took part in the mass protest in the autumn of 2010, and people might remember seeing the police violence used against the students, the kettling of school students as young as 10 and 11, held in freezing conditions, horses being used to charge into kettled crowds, the indiscriminate use of police batoning. And it was a police baton that almost killed Alfie Meadows. He had to undergo emergency brain surgery to save his life, but he is now being charged by the police with violence disorder. This was following him lodging a complaint with the IPCC. I leave for you to draw your own conclusions. One of the reasons why you might have heard of Alfie is because there is and has been a big campaign around him, but his story is similar to the stories of many other protesters that we don't get to hear. I don't know if people remember on the night of the fees vote, on the 9th of December, there was a big furore in the press about a police officer who had apparently been pulled off his horse by the students. And it was very high profile. Cameron waded in and he said that the people responsible belonged in jail. But away from the glare of the media, there was a trial took place of 2 brothers, Andrew and Christopher Hilliard, who were accused of doing this. And they were actually acquitted unanimously by a jury within an hour. And what transpired in the course of that trial is that essentially they had been victims of police violence. The officer in question on the horse didn't like the fact that they were wearing V for Vendetta masks. So he went up to them and pulled them off. And then he decided to pull one of the brothers' hair, and he was pulling it so hard that he slipped off the saddle that he had failed to secure. This is the man, by the way, that is in charge of training officers on how to use their horses. But we don't get an apology from Cameron for this. We don't get an investigation into the, I think it was 11 officers who lined up and supported this guy's story. We don't get mass coverage in the newspapers of the fact that these students were found innocent. What we see is a collusion of resources between the police, the government and the media, really to persecute and criminalise innocent protesters, followed by a collusion of silence and inaction. And I think it's that collusion of interests that have really been exposed in the course of the Murdoch phone hacking scandal, which it's pretty clear the police worked to deliberately cover up. I mean, it's not generally considered usual for police officers to wine and dine the criminals that they're supposed to be investigating. But of course we now know that this is what Paul Stevenson, the head of the Met, in the course of the supposed investigations did at least 18 times with News International chiefs. He also employed a former News of the World executive, Neil Wallace, as his PR officer, and offered accepted a 5-week hospitality at a luxury spa which Wallace worked for. And it seems that the gifts went both ways as well. So Cameron seems to have enjoyed riding on a former police horse through Rebecca Brooks' estate. Now, we know that Paul Stevenson was forced to resign last year because of widespread revulsion about the police's role in the Murdoch scandal, along with John Yates, who has gone on to better things. He now advises the Bahraini government on how to repress protests. But I think that really what you're seeing exposed there is something that goes far beyond personal favours between the tops of the media and the government and the police, but really a web of institutional ties in which they back each other's interests up. So we discover a revolving door of jobs between News International and the Met. We find that police have cashed in hundreds of thousands of pounds for giving information to the media, but you also see the way in which the Murdoch press has time and again repeated police stories. People might remember the lies that were disseminated about John Charles de Menezes after he'd been executed by the police, and we can think about how the press reproduced police pictures of protesters and splashed them on the front pages of their newspapers saying wanted criminal, many people who were after found innocent in court. And I think that really it's that web of institutional ties that's been exposed that begins to tell us something about the real nature of the police. And it's the exposure of the real nature of the police that has even got the police themselves quite worried. At the height of the student protests in 2010, the president of the Association of Chief Police Officers warned of what he said was a growing perception of, quote, cops acting as an arm of the state. And he said that this must be responded to by being clear that, in fact, the police are operationally independent, that we are not being told by our political masters to advance a political agenda, and that if we don't do this, people's anger will continue to grow. And I think that the reason why people's anger has continued to grow since then really is because the interconnections between the scandals and the scale of them make it much harder for them to dismiss it as the product of a few rotten apples, but also because it really exposes the blatant failure of previous reforms to have any impact on how the police behave. You know, it's 13 years since the Macpherson report promised action against institutional racism, and over a decade since the establishment of the Independent Complaints Commission promised a new era of accountability. And we just see the emptiness of those promises in the recent revelations. The recording that was released, made by a teenager, Mario Dimitri, who was stopped in the streets of Newham just after the riots and strangled by a police officer and told, "You will always be a nigger." And the Independent Complaints Commission initially dismissed this complaint and said there was no cause for complaint in this instant, has now been forced to reopen it. But it's a pattern where the IPCC substantiates, I think it is, 3% of the complaints it receives. Complaints that have actually doubled in the last decade or so, standing now at something like 22 complaints for every 100 officers. A phenomenal amount of complaints. And of course we've seen as well the way in which Theresa May has had to now cede to Doreen Lawrence's demand for a second inquiry into the police, following the revelations that the way in which corruption affected the investigation into Stephen Lawrence's murder were not passed on to the Macpherson inquiry. And, you know, as if to kind of come full circle, you know, one of the officers that is at the centre of that corruption in terms of that investigation is a guy called Ray Adams, who, after he left the police, you've guessed it, he went on and worked for Murdoch's News Corporation. And so really what you see is this thread of greed, violence, corruption and utter lack of accountability running through police activity. And I think one of the reasons that it makes people angry is it's precisely the kind of behaviour that we see running through the other institutions as well. The banks, of course, we've seen all what's happened around that over the last few days, the media and the government, who were themselves up to their necks in the expenses scandal, now demanding ordinary people pay the price of the crisis, a government that couldn't even get a mandate. And I think that the role of the police sits at the heart of this, because really they are being used to intervene with force to drive through these austerity measures where the fight for public consent has failed. There was a superintendent who was coming out against the Tories' cuts to the police, who put it like this. He said, "We face a period where disaffection may arise and we will need a strong and confident police force." And so you could see it in the case of the students coming out against the fees. Clearly the government had completely lost the argument. What the students were doing was incredibly popular, and so the police were used to step in to try and reassert public order, but also to do it in a way that was designed to send a message to the students, a message of punishment, but also a message to others that were supporting the students. Don't get any ideas, because we'll come for you in the same way too. I think what's quite interesting is that backfired. Despite all the moral panics in the press, actually you had various polls showing that the majority of people actually supported the students. There was even a poll in the Daily Star which showed like 80% of people supporting the students. And I think it's because the generalised nature of the attacks at the moment means that those resisting are getting a much wider resonance and can draw far greater sympathy when they come under attack by the police. But I think that despite this, the pressure on the police to clamp down means that they continue to attack protesters in a way that risks generating disquiet far beyond the activists involved. People might remember the heavy-handedness towards the UK Uncut activists who occupied Fortnum and Masons. Peaceful occupation, the cops come in, arrest 150 of them, bang them all into vans, and then disperse them around London after strip searching some of them, forcing them to wear white suits and find their way home, sometimes when they had no money. What the internal memos show is partly why they did that is because they were concerned about how popular this style of protest was, the occupation of shops, the protests against tax evasion. And it's why you see the continual warning sounds about possibly using water cannon, possibly using plastic bullets. It's quite obvious, I think, that there's been a shift in relation to protests, but I do think it is part of a wider clampdown that is taking place by a government whose assault is generating fantastic levels of inequality, bitterness and volatility. You think about the riots and how that gave a real snapshot of the grinding police harassment that is taking place inside of working class communities, where stop and search has increased year in, year out. And you see a host of measures being used, ASBOs, Section 60s and so on, to routinely stop and police and repress working class youth. And I think it's also in this context that we need to understand what's happened around some of the big events, the Royal Wedding, the Royal Jubilee, the Olympics, because I think they've taken on a real importance for the Tories trying to boost their popularity, and they're really absolutely terrified of any incident or public protest kind of puncturing that cosy notion of us all being in it together. And that's why you got the pre-crime arrest during the Royal Wedding, and we've got this incredible mobilisation of security, of the military in the run-up to the Olympics taking place as well. And it's well to remember that these are the kind of operations that were developed under the auspices of the 2004 Olympics in Athens that are now being used to mobilise against the mass revolt against austerity that is taking place there. And really, I suppose what I want to do is talk a little bit about what is the role of the police and why do they do this. Because I think, in theory, the police are supposed to be there to protect us, protect public safety and fight crime. They have to sign up to prevent and detect crime, to protect life and property, and to preserve the Queen's peace. Queen's peace bit might give you a bit of a hint as to what they're really about. But in practice, the British Crime Survey shows that police are responsible for resolving under 2% of reported crime. Now, I don't know about you, but if you in your job you had an efficiency rate of 2%, I don't know, I think that your boss or your manager might have something to say about it. But I think the point about it is that trends in crime have much more to do with the wider economic and social climate than they have anything to do with what the police do. Between 1971 and 1981, the police force doubled in number, but recorded crime actually went up. And this is because really crimes under capitalism are primarily defined in terms of crimes committed by the poor against property. If you look at the prison population, really the vast majority of the prison population is made up of people who've committed burglary, robbery or fraud. Essentially, crimes that arise from structural inequalities and poverty, which force people to take desperate measures in order to survive. I think one of the most powerful myths is that we need the police to protect us from physical harm, to deal with crimes such as murder and sexual violence. But I think that here again, predominantly, these crimes are committed by people known to the victim. They tend to take place in the home and not on the street. And they are really complex social products of an oppressive, frustrated and alienated society. And this is one which the police are responsible for reinforcing. And what that means is the police are not only pretty useless in protecting us from these things, but they often have a tendency to see the victim as the cause of the problem. People might remember the Toronto cop who decided to lecture college students that if they wanted to avoid being raped, then they should stop dressing as sluts. You can look at the cases in terms of racist attacks, how the victims are often treated with suspicion and the cause of the problem. This is what happened to Stephen Lawrence, while he lay bleeding on the streets and his best mate was there trying to get them to help him. They were questioning his best mate and basically seeing Dwayne Brooks and Stephen as the perpetrators of a crime rather than the victim. And I think the fundamental problem really is that much of the theft and violence that impacts on our lives, from tax and bank swindles to deaths and injuries at work, cuts in social and health provision, is rarely treated as crime. So we can compare the convictions of the London rioters for looting trivial items like ice cream, frozen chips, bottles of water, to the failure of the police even to bother to turn up to the IPCC to give witness statements about the murder of Mark Duggan. And, it would have been nice if they'd maybe arrested a few more of the MPs who didn't have to smash windows to walk into shops and buy flat-screen TVs with public money. And what this really points to is that the primary purpose of the police is about maintaining a public order, defined in terms of the interests of those who rule. I mean, it's very good to see that Bob Diamond has resigned, but you don't see them knocking on his door and arresting him for fraud. And it's really that role in terms of defending the interests of those who rule which lies behind the force's cosy, corrupt relationship with the rich and their oppressive and racist policing of working class communities. And it's also what drives the police to repress those who resist. Because the modern police force, as we know, was first established in 1829 in response to new forms of resistance that were centred on mass demonstrations and strikes by a newly emergent working class. Really, previously, the ruling class had employed a combination of the army and the yeomanry, which were basically local landowners who armed themselves to put down dissent. But these proved to be increasingly ineffective against a class whose sheer numbers and collective organisation made them much more difficult to control simply by resorting to violence. But also, using violence on a mass scale in that way was very risky for them in terms of really the way in which it risked provoking outrage and anger, but also in terms of the way in which the capitalist class was really trying to legitimise its rule in terms of a set of freedoms and rights which were supposedly open to all. And what you see really is a turning point taking place around the events surrounding the Peterloo massacre in 1819, where you have a mass demonstration of people, about 100,000 people calling for the vote. It's attacked viciously by the yeomanry and the army, and you have 11 people killed and 700 people injured, and you have a massive outcry around it. And it's really the debate that follows out of that you see the police being founded as a kind of more sophisticated way of regulating protest in a less obviously violent way. So police are armed with the truncheon instead of guns or swords. And they're also developed as a national force that can be moved to respond to resistance around the country. And one part about understanding the police is it also represented a shift by the ruling class from more obvious forms of class rule in which there was very little separation between economic and judicial power. You know, essentially, if you were a rich landowner, you employed your own army and yeomanry and you meted out justice. And it was about trying to replace that with the notion that the police were citizens in uniform, functioning on behalf of a state and a set of laws which purported to rule in the public interest, that everyone was subject to and which was indispensable to a well-ordered society. But I think that if you read around the people that were involved in establishing the police at the time, they are very, very explicit about the primary purpose of the police being to facilitate the rule of one class over another. And it's a rule that centres primarily on controlling the sale of labour power and the use to which that labour is put. You have one magistrate, for example, who was the first magistrate to pilot a police force, putting it like this. He says, "Poverty is the most necessary and indispensable ingredient of society. It is the lot of man, it is the source of wealth, since without poverty there would be no labour, and without labour there would be nor riches, nor comfort, nor benefit for those who possessed wealth." And it was also recognised by the other side, the people who were involved in movements resisting at the time. You had a Chartist leader declaring that he was for peace, law and order, but he would have no peace with oppression and injustice. Nor would he call that order which gave one man 10,000 pay for doing nothing, while the working man could only get 10 shillings a week. That was disorder and robbery. And you had a socialist at the time, William Morris, who really talked about how there was an impatience in this period when the police were being set up on the part of the more luxurious part of society to use the police and the law to clear the streets and make them a sort of decent prison corridor with people just trudging to and from work. So that's the kind of origins of the police. But really what you've seen since that period is police numbers and tactics primarily developing in response to levels of social unrest and class struggle rather than recorded levels of crime. So you see during the mass strikes and the union drives of the 1880s, police numbers rising by 10%. They grow by 20% in the Great Unrest that precedes World War I. You see during the strike waves of the 1970s, police being doubled, but also this is where you start to get a national coordinating centre developed, riot squads equipped with CS gas and plastic bullets that are trained in the methods developed by troops occupying Northern Ireland that can be moved to respond around the country. And you see this then being employed during the miners' strike in 1984-85. Up to 8,000 police deployed on a daily basis, really turning whole communities into occupied zones, blocking transport routes in order to stop miners travelling around the country to picket mines out, and 9,000 people arrested. And it's really following the collapse of various miners' trials in the wake of this strike that you also see the Public Order Act being revised to give the police greater powers to criminalise protesters. And it's that Public Order Act that is now being used to criminalise protesters today. It was what was used against the people that protested against the assault on Gaza during the student protests and people beyond that. And the point about this really is to say that really the use of the police as a violent force that contains resistance and dissent has really always been an indispensable element of rule by the capitalist class. But that really how far that force is deployed and its effectiveness have also been shaped by other factors as well. The level of confidence of those resisting, the extent of support for them. And that is why violence has always been combined with efforts to politically isolate those under attack, and a wider strategy that seeks to bind people to the status quo, to encourage people to identify with the various institutions at the top of society. It's something that Lloyd George talked about. He was Prime Minister during the mass struggles of 1919, when he said that to govern millions of hard hands, it must be done by force, fraud and goodwill. And I think that really what we're seeing in the current situation, where you have a major economic crisis, attacks centred on attempts to drive through mass austerity programmes, is you see there's a sense in which their side has far less room for manoeuvre in persuading people that what they're doing is in their best interests, or room for manoeuvre to broker compromises. Instead, really what we are confronted with is this kind of, shock doctrine approach in which people are being told you have to accept this, otherwise it's Armageddon. But people can see, well, when we accept it, it's Armageddon. So we have to fight. And I think that it comes back off really the neoliberal decades, which I think have eroded away many of the material gains, the welfare state, for example, which have been very important in achieving some form of consent, if grudging, in terms of the way it's removing safety nets and a sense that life will get better. And that's why what we're seeing at the moment, really, that is the backdrop to the way in which the police have become a much more prominent feature of politics over the last couple of decades, but in particular over the last couple of years. That's what lies behind the mobilisation of police repression in Greece, where even Amnesty International, had to warn against the government's waging what they said was a chemical warfare against the people there. You see it in Quebec, where you have, how long have they been on strike now? 130-something days, student strike, against the increasing fees. And, the government doesn't know what to do, so they try and repress them. They introduce Law 78, but that then provokes sympathy with wider sections of the population who thinks it's outrageous that the students are being repressed in this way. And I think the thing about Britain is the process is perhaps not as advanced here as it is in certain parts of the world, but nevertheless, the elements are there. If you think about the last time the Tories were in power, they were very careful not to go for everyone all at once. So you had a guy called Nicholas Ridley, who was really the architect of Thatcher's plan to take on the unions. He had a strategy of really attacking unions one by one and so on. But he was also very, very clear about warning the government not to go too far in terms of using the law, the police or the army. So Ridley, quote, rejected proposals to make strikes illegal and the idea of having a strike-breaking corps of volunteers to run the mines, trains and power stations. He said, in strikes in industries where they have the nation by the jugular, the only feasible option is to pay up. And I think what's different between that then and now is that the Tories clearly don't have a strategy for dealing with large-scale resistance. And I think it's one of the reasons why they've also managed to generate dissent amongst the police themselves. Because in May, we saw 30,000 police marching through the streets of London against cuts. We saw Theresa May being utterly humiliated, forced to speak to the Police Federation behind a huge backdrop saying 20% cuts to police is a crime. Now, I think that the motivation behind these cuts is partly ideological. It's about justifying, public sector cuts. It's also part of an ongoing process that's been taking place for a long period, really, of restructuring, of improving efficiency, of outsourcing and privatising certain elements of the police, whilst actually strengthening and maintaining the kind of core force that can be moved around to deal with public disorder. But the discontent that it's stirring amongst the police should be a real warning to the Tories, because last time there was any real serious dissent in the police was 19, 18 and 19, when the police struck over pay conditions and the right to a union. And the government were absolutely terrified. Lloyd George, who I mentioned earlier, said it was the nearest our country came to Bolshevism than any other time in our history. And the government responded very, very quickly. They gave a 13% pay rise and various perks. At the same time, they sacked all the officers that had been involved in the strike. And really, since then, the police have been very, very careful to maintain police privileges. If you look at the rates of pay and conditions of the police, generally, when the struggle rises, their conditions, go up. And the payoff has been that essentially the police have been pretty reliable for the government since that period. And I think that rumbling of discontent is not yet really jeopardising the Tories' ability to count on the police, but it can further weaken the government. But I think recognising that is very different to supporting the police demands. And I say that because the police demonstrated on the day of the public sector strike over pensions, and there were very different responses. There was, I won't tell you which bit I was on, but there was a crowd of people that were, chanting at the police. Blair Peach, never again. Ian Tomlinson, never again. No justice, no peace. But there were also people that were standing and cheering and clapping the police as well. And I think that really we have to be very careful, very clear about not supporting the police. Firstly, although the cuts are real, we should be very clear when they go on about their pensions that the majority of police retire at 50 on a full pension. But more importantly, that their privileges represent a payoff in return for repressing the rest of us. And if you look at the posters that they produced around this, they have posters like young black and white men wearing hoodies, holding guns, saying, you know, cuts are a crime. And I think that is one indication of how actually, if they win, this can be part of actually emboldening them. And emboldening them to do what? To attack us. Emboldening them to crack our heads on protest. Emboldening them to crack heads in the back of police vans. And I think it's like this, really. The role of socialists has to be not to increase the confidence of the police, but to increase the crisis of confidence in the police. And I just think there's a couple of things I want to say to finish in terms of what that means. I think that, firstly, the campaigns against injustice that I talked about earlier can play an important contribution in terms of this process, because any ounce of accountability can hinder their confidence to use violence against us. When you think there has been over 2,500 deaths in custody since 1969 and not a single copper prosecuted for it, one prosecution would deliver some kind of justice, but it also begins a process of inhibiting what they think they can get away with. I think the recent campaigns in defence of the arrested student protesters has also actually played quite an important role in preventing the Crown Prosecution Service and the police from really getting away with victimising and imprisoning students on a big scale. Because initially they arrested lots and lots of people. There were some people who felt completely isolated, intimidated, pled guilty and ended up in prison. 12 months in prison for throwing a flimsy placard stick that hit or hurt no one. But, you know, as the campaign kicked in and joined up with defendants who felt more confident, pled not guilty, what you've seen is a whole series of cases where they have won their cases. And that's very, very important in terms of sending a message to them and making them feel much less confident about victimising protesters in the same way in the future. I think these are an important way in which we can forge unity and solidarity between different struggles as well. You know, the fight against racism being linked with the resistance to austerity, uniting trade unionists with students. And I think that can play an important role in raising our confidence to stand up to the attacks and the use of the law against us in the future. Because there's no question that at different points in the future, we are going to come up against the question of the law, the police and repression. You only have to look at the way in which some of the ministers talked about tightening the anti-trade union laws during the last round of public sector strikes to get a sense of that. And, you know, if you look at the whole history of our resistance and where we've won, a central element of that has been the confidence of people to take on the police and the law as part of it. I was going to talk about the brilliant example of the Pentonville Dockers, but I don't have time. So I'm just going to sum up by saying this, really, which is I think that the police violence, racism and corruption are beginning to really expose the police's role in protecting the rich and powerful. And I think they are drawing wider layers of people into struggle. And I think that engaging with the anger at police injustice and strengthening the channels of expression, linking those to a broader struggle against austerity, is key to achieving some kind of justice. But it can also be part of building a much bigger fight against a system that requires uniformed thugs for its defence. And I think that's really important, because just because lots of people are horrified and outraged about the police and hate the police, that's a very, very different thing to believing that the police are no longer necessary. And ultimately, I want to be part of building a society where we wrest control of our labour and in doing so begin to lay the foundations for a real democratic control over our world. One where we don't need a repressive force to hold people in line, to lock people up, to enforce oppression and class privilege, because the conditions that create them are removed. And I just think one really good illustration of that is the experience of what happened during the Egyptian revolution, because what you saw there in the 18 days that led to Mubarak's downfall is the police not only being beaten but being forced off the streets. You know, the thing that the activists said, fear changed sides. The police started to melt away, they burned their uniforms, there were police stations were burned down, but also you had people beginning to organise their own institutions that were under democratic control, the popular committees that began to patrol the communities in people's interests. Now the fight for that revolution goes on, and of course we've seen the police return to the streets, we've seen the role of the army, and that underlines very, very clearly the role of the police as part of a wider institutions of the state as an instrument of class rule. And it's really, I think the message for us is it means that not only are we going to have to confront the question of the police in struggles, but if we want our struggle against austerity, injustice and racism to succeed, we will also have to destroy the police and other state institutions and replace them with our own.
Hi, I'm Eva. I'm living in Brixton, and for me it's no question at all that the police were racist. I mean, I would say roughly 50-50 when it comes to white and black ratio in Brixton. But I see almost daily black young men being stopped and searched by the police. I've lived there for 10 years, never once seen a white person being stopped and searched by the police. And the question is, it's never really challenged on the street when it happens. We have a lot of, whenever it happens, it is a crowd there to try to be as a witness to what happens. Definitely I do, to see if there's something, violent going on. But what can we do to really challenge it, to really stop that and not allow it? Because I feel that I then live in a community that half of my members are being daily abused for just walking around in the street and absolutely doing nothing criminal at all. That's all I want to say.
I think one of the problems which the police are facing at the moment is a problem with a reduction in their resources, which means that they're being privatised under neoliberalism. And we're getting a lot more private police forces coming into the fore with companies employing people. So in a sense, we're going back to the sort of pre-universal police forces, or some of the experience that we've had in America, where companies have had their police forces, and there's a lot more private security firms. Certainly within Plymouth, we have the military going around being their own police force. We've had that for a long time. But there are private companies which have security guards, which the government seems to be bent on extending their powers, getting more and more police liaison and community support officers to do the more routine elements of police work. And I think that there is a certain amount of tension within the police there. So I think that the system is a little bit under strain. And I want to draw attention to the riots which occurred last summer. There's been a big report into that, which the Guardian and LSE newspapers have been highlighting this week. And I don't agree with a lot of the analysis and stuff which was within that. But one of the things that came out of that was just how stretched the police were in containing those riots, particularly in London, where it was erupting in different places, and how poor the coordination was between the different forces. So I think there'll probably be this trend towards empowering private sector agencies to act as quasi-police and giving them more and more powers, but also a move towards integrating the different police forces into a national force. But one of the lessons which came out of those riots is that if there is trouble, and if it was organised demonstrations by different trade unionists in different places at different times, they actually wouldn't be able to cope with this. If the working class was organised and striking and taking action effectively in different places, the police would actually scuttle away a bit like they did in Egypt. And we would have to take on the responsibility of leading those communities with working people. And I think we could do it.
When I first joined the SWP, I became a bit sceptical of the position that's taken up about the police. But coming from Ireland, I wouldn't say that's too unusual, because I think that there's a bit of different tradition surrounding the Irish police force and the British police force. You explained a bit about the history of the establishment of the police here, and how there's a lot of hatred in working class communities. Whereas in Ireland, when we replaced the armed British soldiers on the streets with non-armed Irish police, it seemed a bit different. It was a bit more welcomed from people, but then slowly but surely within the more manual working class areas, the resentment grew towards the police. But I still don't think it's at the same level as it is here. There's a few different reasons, but the thing that really turned me personally and then politically, but personally, I was arrested 6 months after a student protest at 8:30 in the morning. They came to my house to take me away for 12 hours, accused me of membership of the real IRA and everything else, all this nonsense, pure intimidation. They knew who I was, they knew that wasn't the case, but it was just to intimidate me. And then secondly, the political aspect came about when I coupled that with looking at a few different reports and things that came out about the role of the police and the abuse of children in state care and in care of the church and reformatory schools, whereby little boys and girls had been abused by priests, and this was reported to police on numerous occasions, and they did absolutely nothing about it. Whereby the only thing they did about it was to maybe move priests from one parish to another to ensure that either that they commit things again or that it wouldn't be noticed. So it was the police were acting between the church and the state as being the dirty ones in doing the dirty work. And then last year there was one incident that it's always going to stick in my mind in Mayo with the Shell to Sea campaign, where the number of activists in the local community are preventing a gas giveaway from the state, giving away gas to Shell, and the building of an oil refinery on the west coast. There was an activist climbed up on top of a tractor that was trying to come in to build the oil refinery, and she was arrested, and her friend was arrested who had the camera. The camera was put in the back of the police car, and the camera was still recording, and the police were joking and they're talking and laughing and whatever else, and they were saying, oh yeah, we should have taken her in, and then one of them goes, oh yeah, we should have raped her. And then all of them started laughing, and this is 5 guards in a police car laughing and joking about the rape of a young woman protester, and still to this day nothing has been done about it, and it's kind of just brushed aside as if it's normal. So the hatred for ordinary people that's in the police force is right down to the root, and you might go, oh well, they help little old women across the road here and there, and I think that kind of thing justifies the wider oppression of the police, whereby you might go, oh, your local guard, he's a sound lad or whatever, he gave me a lift before. Those little things that they do, really, it doesn't justify the wider oppression, but for a lot of people, they look that aside. But I think we also need to look at what's happening in Greece at the moment, and in particular with our sister organisation recently, where they were attacked by the fascists, by the Golden Dawn in their office. And the police also attacked them as well, because one of the journalists for the sister organisation, the socialist worker over there, had taken a picture of fascists beating up an immigrant, and the police were standing by in the picture looking at it, and so they were attacked by that. But also at the last elections, it was proven by looking at an analysis of the polling stations close to the police stations that it's clear that the police vote in large numbers for the Golden Dawn, in somewhat at least 50% for the fascist party. So there is a huge problem with the police all around the world as being a tool of repression for the state. Thanks.
I really wanted to touch on the point that Eva made there, like the great point about stopping the insertion of young black males. That serves 2 purposes. First is the public humiliation. If you're constantly seeing black people stopped and searched, that says to you, right, the police, they are clearly doing something right here. There must be something wrong with these black people, why it's only them that get stopped and searched. Second thing that can do is to yourself as a black person, an Asian person, that can internalise that mentality. You must say, well, hold on, if I'm constantly being victimised for doing nothing, there clearly is something wrong with me and my race, and that keeps people put in their corner, which is what society aims to do. Society aims to put us in justice and keep those boxes checked. What that serves to do is it stops the unification of whites, blacks and other working class. They say, well, I'm working class, they're working class, but I'm not like them. I don't get stopped and searched in the street. I'm not a criminal danger or a criminal threat to anyone. So that's one of the most important things that stopping the searching does. And as well as internalising that mentality to you, it also causes a distrust and a hatred of the police, and that's assimilated with blacks and whatever. And in all honesty, rightly so. Another thing is what the speaker talked about was what is crime. Crime is defined as crime against property and those against the ruling class. For instance, the people that were someone stole a bag of rice in the protest, went to jail. People having a joke on Facebook got 4 years in prison. But when the bankers take their bonuses, the MPs do take their expenses and do whatever, they're not charged. And we also have the presenter of Top Gear saying that these people should be lined up and shot in front of their families. That's fine, that's cool, because he's a speaker, he's on the television and he's part of that ruling class. So what we need to do is that when we do see people being stopped and searched, as Eva said, is we need to question it. And it's something that police really get worried about, is when you take your mobile phone out and start filming them, they get really pissed off about it because they know that can go across. And the last thing I want to touch on is when we talk about the privatisation, the outsourcing of the police, The main thing that is to do, just as with the EU Council and whatever that have been built thereafter, and the creation of the Bank of England, is to stop the accountability of the government. Once we can't blame the government, then we say, who do we blame? There's no one for us to blame, and then we feel defeated. So in order for us not to feel defeated, and to constantly be able to say, no, there is something that we can protest and rise against, is that privatisation was given out by that same government, and those are the people that we should be protesting against.
I have kind of a comment and a question. You said that in the end, the solution, if we have a more equal society, then there wouldn't be a lot of things that happens, and the police wouldn't be a necessity anymore. But I come from Latin America, where we have a lot of crime-ridden cities, and it's true that the police in Latin America is as brutal or more brutal than the police here, and has been in the service of the ruling class. But at the same time, there's still a criminal problem which the people are affected by it. And some solution has been brought up, which is community policing, that tries to mix up the community with the police, giving more control to the community over how the police act and what the police does, which aims, or the theoretical aim at least, is that the police will become more democratic, and it would actually really help to protect people from crime and other types of abuse. But at the same time, to me, it's kind of scary that maybe that's just a way of the police to keep being what it is and just justify itself even more, because it has ties with the community, and it can even create a power structure between the community. And I would like to hear a comment if community policing is a good or it's not a good idea.
Hi, I'm from Ireland as well, and just on that community thing, like I work in childcare, and one of the things that absolutely terrifies me about the police, the growing power of the police over my lifetime type of thing, is this whole background checking, criminal records, and this. Like as somebody said, you get arrested for protesting, and the next thing is you can become unemployable in many, many spheres of work. I have seen it done. It was an absolutely typical thing 20, 30 years ago, that the police would just knock on the door of a business and say, do you know that she's in Sinn Féin? Do you know that that Link to IRA organisation member is employed by you? If they do that when people are just new in on the job, it's very, very easy for employers to just drop the people before they ever have any rights at work. But the other thing, the privatisation, I think in Ireland they wouldn't dare with the privatised police, considering they're not very far from armed struggle with the Republican movement. But it really is scary for Irish people to see that sort of thing just more and more and more happening in Britain. Somebody's in the dock and there's 4 security men with them. Little children are locked up over immigration things. And who runs where they're locked up? Security firms. It just is absolutely scary. And a lot of this sort of abuse can come from the sort of community style policing. The typical example of that was in Jersey, as they said, hobby bobbies, the land of millionaires, the community policing there. Kids were being picked up for whatever, shoplifting, little things, and there was no other thing that was ever done with them except that they were locked up. And once they were locked up, they were subject to abuse, and ferocious scandals came out of that. Just one last example I want to do about this criminal records checking business that really gets me, the Holly and Jessica case, those 2 little girls who were murdered. It has been given out as an example why there should be more sort of the police using themselves as an employment agency thing, more checking of people. Where if you look into the background of Ian Huntley, who was convicted of murdering those children, he several times was brought to the attention of the police for sort of statutory rape style issues. And on many occasions, the parents ended up in trouble with the police. The parents who would go and say, my 14-year-old is living with this man, I want you to go and get her away from him. And obviously, losing it in the police station when they were getting no support from the police, they end up in trouble. The police checking was not the problem with that man. The police failing to investigate the many sexual and violent crimes that it seems he did prior to the murder is the problem. Thank you.
I think what Hannah said about there being a very deep crisis of legitimacy in the police is incredibly important. I mean, the police have always been corrupt. The combination of unaccountable power and spending a lot of time with criminals always leads to corruption. Secondly, if you want to catch criminals, the best people to ask are other criminals, who you then have to license and allow to carry on their activity, and that relationship gets greased with money. The interesting thing is, I mean, in the 1970s there was a major corruption in the London police force, but it was with small-time capitalists, typically on the sort of shady end of the law, like pawn barons in Soho or bank robbers who the police were colluding with. Today, it's with the biggest of multinationals, like News International. I mean, it's staggering, really. I think there's a lot more to come out about that. Secondly, we've seen the resurfacing of racism. You think about not just the examples Hannah gave, the sharpest end of people dying in custody, but think about the story in The Guardian of a black firefighter who went to help the police during the riots. They ended up arresting him because they just assumed he's black, he's a rioter, and abused him. Right? This kind of stuff's coming out. Also think about the clamping down of dissent. I mean, what they did to the miners was vicious, but it was in pit villages a long way away. Not everyone really understood what was going on. When they attacked students protesting against something that most people think is appalling, the hike in fees, and they do it in the middle of Parliament Square, it's very, very visible and has huge impact. Now, the reason I think all of this is important is that what Hannah touched on, the police have always talked about policing by consent. Now, what this means is they wanted to make sure they had popular support amongst the majority, so that when they attacked young black people or the revolutionary left or a group of strikers, most people would have some sympathy for the police. Right? In other words, politically isolate them. And in many ways, policing by consent is the flip side of the dominant idea in the 20th century in Britain, which is if you want change, you do it through piecemeal fashion, you do it through the institutions of society, through reform. Right? The fact that sense that the police are rotten and corrupt and on the side of the Tories and the bosses, the fact that that's now spreading beyond just the young black population, beyond the revolutionary left, deeper and deeper into society, opens up profound questions about what the role of the state in society is. How do you get change? In other words, it can open up much more radical ideas about how you transform society, and therefore I think our job is to deepen and accelerate that process of people understanding that the police and the state are not on our side, are not neutral, and cannot be used to change society.
I'm from the Irish SWP as well. Just something that Carol there said about the student demonstration. On the student demonstration, what happened was we went in and the doors of the Department of Finance were open, so we walked in and sat down. Very, very simple act. Unfortunately, the police came in and attacked us, and I was one of the people that were attacked. In fact, I was knocked unconscious by the guards. But when I went in to report it, basically what they were saying was, well, weren't you one of the people inciting a riot? And I was sitting there thinking to myself, how could I incite a riot if I was unconscious? They were trying to make that link in the papers that students were violent, but, and this is one of the things that I want to talk about. What is, when you're on a demonstration, well, what is violence? And what they always try to convey, no matter what protest it is, if there's any hint of anything that goes wrong on their side, the protesters were violent, and that's what they say. And it doesn't matter the level of police brutality, the people were violent, and their violence gets basically brushed aside, and that's what's happened over here, and it's what's been happening over in Ireland as well. And I mean, the rape tape was one of those incidents where police smugness was on show, and the fact that they were sitting there and they came out and said, well, what are you going to do about it? And what happened was people were outraged, of course. Well, what they were saying was, oh, well, two of them are now gone from the force, so we can't do anything about them. Another person's gone to another district, we can't do anything about that. And it was basically brushed under the carpet and said, oh, well, this happened, we have to learn from it, get over it. But what I want to come to is the whole idea of the role of the state and the role of the police within the capitalist state. And I mean, over in Ireland, we've had huge struggles over the last couple of years. And one that really sticks out in my mind is Thomas Cook, where 14 workers, predominantly young women, occupied their workplace because they were basically told, oh, in an hour, collect your stuff and go. You're not getting any redundancy, so they occupied. And what happened was there was an injunction placed on them to get out of their workplace. And on a bank holiday, never before has this happened in Ireland, on a bank holiday there was 3 court cases. And in all of those court cases, the unions were only there for one of them. And then they went down to their workplace and said, oh, well, there's nothing we can do. If you stay here, you're going to get arrested. And then they fucked off. So basically, the workers stayed there. And on that bank holiday, the judge signed the injunction so they could come at any time. And of course, when did the police think it was the best time to come? 5:30 in the morning when there was nobody around. And they smashed in that door with a battering ram. For 14 women, they smashed in that door. But it goes to show, and even in the dockers' strike of 2009-2010 in Ireland again, 14 injunctions placed on the workers within the first 2 weeks. So they couldn't look in at the docks because it was seen as threatening behaviour. They couldn't stop any of the vans to talk to the drivers. They couldn't do anything. So this goes to show the role of the state, like Hannah was saying, is not neutral, it's not separate, it's not independent. In fact, it exists. The sole existence is to reenact the old traditions of capitalism in protecting personal wealth or wealth. But just one more quick thing. In December 2009, there was another protest held by students in Belfast, and predominantly people under the age of 18. They took over the streets. They weren't happy standing on the side of the street, so they took over the roads of Belfast. And the people that were arrested were the people that had megaphones. And one of them, a friend of mine who's in the SWP there, he was brought to court and he was told, when he was released on bail, he was told he was not allowed to enter Belfast City without looking for a job, so without a CV. And he was also told he had to inform the police and get permission from the police if he wanted to join another protest. So that's the whole idea of police control. And that's what it's coming to. And just to address something that was said from that lady over there, that Ireland would not privatise their police force, that is a lie. Because recently, we've seen a huge wave of protests, especially from the campaign against household tax, which is like the poll tax over here. And the Labour Party, who claims to be the party of the working class, who most of its National Executive Committee are part of the unions, are union leaders. They hired security. The police force wasn't enough. They hired security, and what happened when they saw that the private police was people went through the barricades. They were not afraid of the police anymore because they'd gotten the confidence of the last couple of weeks in politicising themselves, and people are losing their fear of the police. And that's what we have to aim for. Undermine the police as they try to undermine us.
I just wanted to say a little bit about the relationship between the police and fascists. People will know that since 2008 there's been the English Defence League, and you've seen the re-emergence of fascist and racist street movements, mostly targeting Muslims, but actually targeting anyone they don't like. I just want to very briefly summarise what I've seen in terms of the way the police have responded to that. The first thing to say is they officially say that they're there to facilitate demonstrations, and they're not on either side. Of course, this is rubbish. If you look at the videos and things like that of the police in the VDL demos, certainly in the early stages, the police are very matey with them. They're laughing and joking. I don't think it's be a surprise to anyone here that there's a fair amount of sympathy for EDL points of view among the police. Occasionally, you then end up scrapping with the EDL, but it's on several occasions the EDL have broken out of their pens or broken out of their kettles and gone running around and causing mayhem and attacking Asians and attacking Muslims. It's happened in Dudley, it's happened in Leicester, has happened. There was a little mini race riot in Stoke when the EDL got out of there. In contrast, their attitude to the anti-fascist protests is one of unremitting hostility and racism. We know this because councillors that we work with in United Against Fascism, who are sympathetic to us, have told us about the secret briefings that the police give to the councillors, and the entire focus of those briefings is stories about how the anti-fascists are the ones who cause the trouble, the anti-fascists are all Trotskyists and anarchists, the anti-fascists are the ones we need to be careful of. The other thing that they're completely obsessed with is Muslim youth. They go out of their way to stop Muslim youth from coming out onto the streets and demonstrating. They will use the PREVENT programme, which is meant to be this anti-terrorist thing, to try and shift Muslim youth away from the demo on the day. They will get youth workers to try to threaten any Muslim youth who want to go on the demo and say you'll be arrested if you do it. If you see in places like Bolton, when groups of Asian youths tried to join the UAF counter demo, they were stopped by the police. So that happened in Luton as well. If there's one thing they want that's worse for them than Muslim youth coming out onto the streets, it's Muslim youth linking up with the rest of the anti-fascist movement. And I think there's a lesson in that. The final thing I want to say is that when fascists go out and do these demonstrations, their aim is to terrify and terrorise black and Asian communities into staying at home and hiding behind the curtains. That is the point of what they're doing. And when the police say to black and Asian communities, you shall not come out and demonstrate, and when shamefully sections of the left say to black and Asian communities, you should not come to demonstrate, they are colluding in what the fascists are trying to do. And that's why we should have no truck with that. If the fascists come to town, you have to get out there and demonstrate, you have to support the demonstration, and be warned, the police will be on the side of the Nazis.
Really good discussion. Thanks, everyone. I mean, just to come back on a few points. The point that was made at the beginning about the stop and search in Brixton and so on, and of course, the racism is absolutely endemic in terms of the police force. I mean, I think the latest figures are if you're black, you're 30 times more likely to be stop and searched, and in terms of deaths in custody, 14% are black minority and ethnic people. And I think in terms of what we do about it, some people talked about, you know, the kind of stopping and keeping a watch on what the cops are doing. And there is a history of doing this. I mean, after the riots in London in the 1980s, there was a thing about people in groups stopping and watching what the police did. And there is an initiative in East London in the run-up to the Olympics where you're basically seeing whole exclusion zones, which are giving the police immense powers, essentially to harass working class youth. There has been an initiative launched by the New Monitoring Project to bring people together to actually observe what they are doing. Those initiatives can be important, but I think fundamentally it is about what I was talking about earlier in terms of trying to politically campaign to shape a climate that inhibits what the cops feel that they can get away with, because we can't be everywhere all at once. And it's very, very clear that they have an absolute arrogance about what they think they can get away with, because they do get away with it. I mean, I don't know if people have been following the trial of Simon Harwood. You know, he's up for the manslaughter of Ian Tomlinson, who was pushed over and died at the G20 protests a few years ago. And it's only thanks to footage that came out that we actually, have to try and begin to get to the truth of this. But he was questioned about it and essentially asked, had he thought about the various things that he could have done differently to respond. And he essentially said, I've thought about using a truncheon, gas, maybe a gun. And the guy said, the prosecutor said, that's all kind of physical, immediately, violent, repressive response. And, you just think, this guy, is finally being dragged into the courts, and still there is no sense, really, that he has done anything wrong at all. So I think the question about how we build political campaigns that start to change the climate, that start to police the police a bit, are quite important. And I think that one important development that's taken place over the last couple of years in terms of a growing questioning of the police and anger of the police is actually you are beginning to see different campaigns start to come together. You know, you are beginning to see that the trade unions and the student movement begin supporting getting behind the justice campaigns. There was a fantastic meeting in central London with John Carlos and Doreen Lawrence and Janet Alder, bringing the things together. You had about 1,500 people there, flanks of trade unionists coming in groups and sitting down. And you had a sense that that's the key really in terms of starting to shape and rechange that climate. But we have to be clear at the same time that there's only a limit to what we can do, because the police are not going to change their slots. You know, the police racism stems from their role in policing and patrolling working class communities, and because of racism, you know, black communities are more concentrated in terms of the urban centres, in terms of the unemployed and the poor, but also because the police's role is to enforce on an equal and just society, they tend to reflect in a much more intense way some of the more backward prejudices and ideas in terms of racism and so on as well. I mean, the last speaker just talked about the stuff in terms of fascism, but there is a long road here in terms of the kind of racism but also fascist sympathies within the police. One of the reforms that was called for coming out of the riots in the 80s was that the police should undergo equality training. The problem with it is when the feedback forms came back for the equality trainer, one of the things that was most asked for by the cops is that they would be given more information about the National Front. I mean, you know, this kind of gives you a sense of it, and people remember the documentary, The Secret Policeman, all the exposure of the kind of wide membership of the BNP amongst the cops, and of course the way that they have been used more recently against people trying to protest against the EDL. And there's a very important point there in terms of how the police are used to enforce law and the way in which they choose to enforce the laws, because the Public Order Act was initially introduced in the 1930s, supposedly to take on the extremist right and the fascists. But actually, time and time again, what you actually see it being used is to police and repress anti-fascists and the left. And the latest that I was hearing is what's happening in terms of Bristol, where the EDL are going to try and march in Bristol, and there's a big response there in terms of the community, the trade unions and so on coming together to build for a big mobilisation. But there are now rumours that the cops are talking about opening up 24-hour courts on the day following the protest. Maybe that's for the EDL, but possibly and probably not. And just on the question of the 24-hour courts, it brings me to the thing about the riots, because actually the 24-hour courts thing was the thing that they were used in the riots to basically put through this kind of production line justice. And it was an example of how initially the police were able to regain the initiative, I think, a little bit politically. There was actually quite a lot of support initially for the police in terms of how they dealt with the riots, and organisations like the SWP who stood out very firmly in defending the rioters, in saying it was an uprising of rage and anger against police racism and yet another police murder of a black man. Actually, initially that was not a very popular position, and we warned precisely this. Actually, if you let them get away with it with one group, like they did around the rioters, exemplary sentencing, 24/7 courts, they'll come back and that they'll use it against others as well. And I think that's very, very important in terms of learning some of the lessons of what we've been through, the victimisation of the student protesters and some of the other protesters, in terms of actually winning a solidarity across our movement that recognises they can go for weaker groups first, but then they'll come for stronger groups later. And you've got a little bit of a taste of that in terms of the Corriton dispute, when workers working for the oil refinery were sacked and went down to try and have a mass picket to close down the refinery, and you saw people being arrested and charged there. And that is a sense of what could be to come. But I also think it's very important, just to finish, to recognise, as I try to draw out and as other people have said, is that the prominence of the police, it is a sign of their weakness. The fact they're having to resort to the police in this kind of way, because there's a great deal of discontent and anger and volatility in British society at the moment because of what is taking place. And you know, you look at reading the riots reports on the police, and you can see they're all over the place in terms of how to respond to the riots. this is just, I mean, I know there were full-scale riots around the country, but really on one level, you know, that it was just riots across a number of cities. They didn't also have to deal with students coming out and demonstrating, and the trade union movement coming out and strikes all at the same time. And so it does underline really their weakness as well. And I just want to kind of finish on this, because this was really, really brought home to me, reading a letter that was sent into Socialist Worker anonymously about a disaster exercise that was organised to prepare the police and the security services on how to deal with potentially disaster events during the Olympics. And the exercise focused on some of the rulers' worst nightmares. The participants of this exercise had to imagine the Olympic Games were in full swing. And they were told to imagine that the Games were a great success with sunny weather and huge crowds on the streets in a party atmosphere. However, they were asked then to factor in some traffic problems in London, near Weymouth in Dorset. They also had to be aware of the Voice of the Poor, a new protest movement. Voice of the Poor marches were springing up all over the country, mainly good natures, but including a hardcore of troublemakers called Redcon. They were also told to imagine that the Olympics had become a focus for discontent involving other protest groups like Fathers for Justice and the United Cabbies Group, and that what's more, a public order incident had broken out in Coventry during an anti-war demonstration. As if that wasn't enough, French intelligence warned of the new anti-capitalist party organising a blockade of Calais against the corporate takeover of the Olympics. This is a real live exercise that the police and security were put through, and it does show really their fears in terms of their inability to control discontent if it really begins to spill out on a major scale. And I think that really what we have seen over the last couple of years is we saw the fight against austerity sparked by Millbank and the students. We saw then the major trade union demonstrations and the strikes, and we had the uprisings in Tottenham and many cities around Britain. I think what you get a sense of now is that we're going into an autumn where there is a potential for those elements to come together. We have a major TUC demonstration, we have the prospects of more strikes, and we also have a national student demonstration for education as well. And so if we want to really kind of take on the COPs effectively, really for me that's a political question about how we link all those movements together to really begin to begin to punch our power. And within that, we need to be prepared and organise or understand the importance of building solidarity campaigns where necessary, of linking up with the wider struggles that are taking place against injustice, the justice for the Rigg family, the justice for the Tomlinson family, but also have a bit of a vision of what we're fighting for as well. I don't think that community policing is the answer. I don't think we can take hold of the police and reform them. They are, at the end of the day, an instrument of class repression to crush our dissent, and therefore we have to destroy that institution and replace it with our own institutions, democratic, accountable, run by the people, shaped by the people. That's the kind of society that we have to fight for. No justice, no peace.